The organizers of the festival asked me to talk about my last book, which is called The Animal Part, Human and Other Animals in the Poetic Imagination, available at all good bookstores, including Amazon. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk for about half an hour or so, I think, which should leave us plenty of time for discussion at the end. So the question that the book asks is this. How does literature help us work out feelings or intuitions that we have in our encounters with animals that don't seem easy to express in ordinary language? So in trying to answer that question, I was especially concerned with two aspects of literature that help us get us beyond our everyday feelings of constraint. First, it's imaginative resources, the ability to invent fictional situations outside the realm of everyday life. And second, it's material resources, things like meter, rhyme, and the look and feel of words on the page. So the way I see it in the book, the imaginative resources of literature allow for a kind of expansion or blow-up of everyday experience so that what are only hints and suggestions in everyday life get a space of their own in which they can be sort of writ large. Whereas the material resources afford a kind of formalization of intuitions. They stylize sort of momentary feeling for things that you get in intuition into a pattern so that you can sort of inhabit it at greater length. The key experience for me in sort of getting me to write the book was a beaver that I ran into in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I was sort of like in the beaver's way as it was trying to get something done on the shore of the lake where I was camped. And I had a sort of flash of understanding for the frustration it was experiencing, like watching it swim up and down in front of me and not be able to come ashore. I felt the same way I feel when I'm in the library and like can't find a book that's supposed to be on the shelves, right? I sort of walk up and down the stacks in disbelief before eventually accepting that I'm just going to have to do something else that day and go about my business, which is exactly what the beaver did in due course. So something about being this close to an animal again brought back memories of my childhood in England, where I did a lot of hunting when I was a younger person. And I realized that the sort of strange feeling of intimacy with animals that hunters have had sort of stayed with me at some level. And I began to explore the archive of animal literature from ancient Greece and the 20th century that dramatizes these feelings of intimacy. So the first chapter of the book, which is the first one I wrote, is all about identification. And the kind of identification that came to interest me most was one that kind of goes back and forth between feelings of aggression and abjection. So aggression I think is pretty self-explanatory. But by abjection, I mean a sort of tangle of feelings that have to do with helplessness, loathing, disgust, both for yourself and for others, and which appears in a certain kind of animal literature as the flip side of the self-explanatory identification with animal aggression. In Antiquity, this bipolar affect found a home in what was called Iambic poetry after its meter. But whereas the Iambic pentameter in English is, or was maybe, a marker of high style, Iambic poetry in the ancient world was a low form. Unlike the solemn dactylic hexameter, which was the meter of epic for the Greeks, iambic rhythms were very close to everyday speech. They came to be used for dialogue in tragedy and comedy, but their first appearance is in poems of insult, abuse, and self-abasement. Poems in which, as ancient critics put it, the poet has told us more about himself than we would care to know. So the most famous writer of this kind of poetry in antiquity was called Archilochus. And his poetry is remarkable not only for the frequency of his identification with animals, foxes, hedgehogs, and ants, for example, all appear as alter egos of the poet, but also for the precision in which he observes animal characteristics in others. For example, a woman waving her arms during sex looks like a kingfisher flapping its wings on a protruding rock. A man with a noteworthy erection looks like a corn-fed breeding ass from Priene. A frightened soldier cowers on the ground like a rock partridge. Now, the Greeks worry a lot about whether human culture blunts our powers of observation and self-knowledge in the same way that they thought domesticated animals lose their natural capacities. And Archilochus likes to play with this fear in his audience. His powers of observation, his ability to characterize others as animals, are a way of presenting himself as, well, still wild, if you take his word for it, or feral, if you believe his critics. The poet who really caught my attention, though, is actually a lesser known figure by the name of Hipponax, who was notorious for inventing a meter that was named after him. So in the regular iambic meter, the iambic meter proper, a line has to end with a short syllable followed by a long one, right? Like didum, right, in English terms. So what Hipponax did was to replace this penultimate short syllable, right, which is the very thing that makes the meter recognizable as iambic, with a long syllable, right? So instead of didum, what you get is dum, dum, right, which wasn't recognizable as anything. I mean, it sounded awful to the Greeks, and they called it the lame, limping, or crippled iamb. Hipponax used it for scenes of human degradation that go really way beyond anything in Archilochus. Hunger, ugliness, masochism, defecation seem to have been his favorite themes, and he portrays himself as a kind of human scapegoat, living a life somewhere between human and animal. Now, the meter gives expression to this life that is neither one thing nor another by sort of giving up on being art, right at the moment when it's sort of called upon to fulfill its destiny as a poetic line. And this failure, I mean, it's not just a one-time local effect, right? So this is a kind of meter. So the defect is repeated line after line, right, for as long as the poem lasts. I mean, if you can imagine hearing someone hitting the same wrong note, like, over and over again, like, that's what it sounded like to them. So Hipponax might have remained a sort of curiosity of ancient literature, sort of marginal interest to specialists in ancient Greek poetry, were it not for the fact that William Carlos Williams cites a passage about him from a handbook of Greek literature as the epigraph to his long poem, Patterson, and I'll quote that. By their acceptance of this halting meter, the Greeks displayed their acute aesthetic sense of propriety, recognizing the harmony which subsists between crabbed verses and the distorted subjects with which they dealt. So if you take this hint seriously, it makes Patterson a lot easier to understand. I mean, it's been a greatly misunderstood poem. So, I mean, it isn't trying to be a modernist epic like Eliot's Wasteland or Pound's Cantos, because it's constantly giving up on itself, right, like Hipponax's Iamb. Even its dog narrator and its sort of magic dwarf muse, sort of inspirational character in the poem, make a lot more sense if you compare them with the kinds of identification with non-human life, especially animal life, that are the norm in ancient iambic poetry. And as well as offering a way through Patterson, right, the back and forth between aggression and objection in ancient iambic poetry is also helpful in understanding the trajectory of Williams' poetic career as a whole, right? So Whereas the dog poet in Patterson, right, this persona of the poet as dog, is aggressive, curious, and deeply involved in the low life of his city. The animals of Williams' also greatly misunderstood late poetry are clumsy, injured, dead, or dying, and their lives are rendered in versions of Williams' sort of signature triadic line that frequently stammer or give out as they try to communicate what it is like to be the animal in question. So here's an example from the poem To Daphne and Virginia. Men, against their reason, speak of love sometimes when they are old. It is all they can do. Or watch a heavy goose who waddles, slopping noisily in the mud of his pool. So this is about as far as you can get from the young Williams claim that a poem is, quote, a small or large machine made of words, unless it's the soft machine of animal tissue that we hear in this poem, sort of like wearing out before our eyes. Williams' abortive rhythms, as Wallace Stevens called them, have abandoned the modernist fetishization of the inorganic for a biopoetics of abjection, is what I call it in the book. And this fetishization of the inorganic is the subject of the second chapter of the book. I went back before the modernist obsession with the machine to writers of the second half of the 19th century, and their obsession with marble, metal, minerals, and jewels as ways of imagining an ideal setting for human beings from which all traces of the organic have been removed. So what I was trying to do here was to sort of think the other side of E.O. Wilson's book, Biophilia, some of you may have known, which argues that human beings have a sort of innate delight in the natural beauty of organic forms. And what I wanted to show was that, while this, that may be true, there is also such a thing as biophobia, and that the aesthetic biophobia of 19th century literature coincides with some of the great animal slaughters in recent history, the destruction of the American bison, the whaling industry, to name but a couple. Milton's Paradise Lost helped me a lot in thinking about this. Milton's descriptions of the architecture of hell, if you have those in mind, in Paradise Lost, are sort of fantasias on the inorganic that parody the beauty of heaven. And understood why Milton's Satan lies behind so many 19th century accounts of human narcissism. Satan embodies a kind of ambivalence about the beauty of the world, right? So on the one hand, he recognizes it, but on the other hand, what it inspires in him is a desire to destroy it. And the root of this divided mind is a narcissism that prevents him from acknowledging his continuity with other forms of life, and which I think is arguably the cause of his rebellion in the poem in the first place. In any case, I mean, this narcissism goes uncorrected in Paradise Lost, whereas 19th century fictions dramatize the possibility of a redemptive encounter with other animals. The two examples I consider at length in the book are Ishmael versus Ahab in Moby Dick, and Flaubert Saint-Julien, who becomes a hermit and eventually a saint after an encounter with the ghosts of the animals he has hunted. So those are the first two chapters that make up the first part of the book. And their aim is to illuminate how positive and negative reactions to our own animality are made palpable in literature. The last two chapters make up part two, and their aim is to explore how the desire to become an animal is dramatized in literature. The third chapter looks at works in which human beings try to join animal societies, and the fourth deals with the literature of metamorphosis. So Greek comedy had a whole subgenre devoted to staging encounters between human beings and animals. Aristophanes' Birds is the only play of this kind that has survived in its entirety. But there are copious fragments by lesser-known authors from plays called Goats, Wild Animals, and Fish, among others. I mean, fish would have been particularly interesting, I think, because there's a proverb in Greek, right, silent as a fish, so it would be interesting to see how that worked on the stage. But anyway, in all the plays that we have, are, either in their entirety or in fragments, human beings meet talking animals on the stage, and these talking animals voice their own understanding of their lives, including how the forms of sociality that are natural to them are lost when human beings domesticate them for food and labor. So Aristophanes' Birds is about two Athenians who are disgruntled with civic life in Athens. Illegal immigrants, government bureaucracy, and endless foreign wars have made their city intolerable to them. Right? Does that sound familiar? And they set off in search of a better life, taking a crow and a jackdaw with them as their guides to the wilderness, which in this play begins right outside the city walls of Athens. So these guide birds eventually direct them to the house of Tereus, who is a famous mythological figure who's been turned into a hoopoe, right, a kind of bird, for his crimes against humanity. And between them, they concoct a plan to turn the birds of the world into an avian superpower, right? Because the birds control the air, they stand between gods and men, and they can use this position to take over the cosmos as a whole. So this being comedy, they succeed, and one of the Athenians becomes god, king, emperor of the universe. But what's really interesting about the play are the reflections on human and bird society that get dramatized along the way. Birds have a special proximity to human beings in the Greek imagination, and not just because, as in the native cultures of the American plains, birds are the other animal, right, with two legs, like human beings. But Aristotle, in his zoological works, devotes a lot of attention to the physiology of sound production among animals. And he comes up with a three-part schema, right? So animals without lungs can make noises by rubbing body parts together, right? Crickets, for example. Animals with lungs and mouths have a voice, right? Frogs and cows, for example. And animals with lungs, mouths, and flexible tongues, right, are capable of articulate utterance, right? Because they can use the air coming out of their mouths, right? They can divide the air coming out of their mouths, right, into discrete units of sound by using their flexible tongue. Now, it's interesting, right? Aristotle doesn't say speech here, right? For this last category includes birds as well as human beings, right? Which leaves him in a bit of a bind. So if nature makes nothing in vain, which is his general rule of thumb, and human beings use their capacity for articulate utterance to engage in rational discourse, what is it that birds do, right, with the same capacity, right? They ought to be able to do something with it, or they ought to do something with it. So Aristotle goes back and forth on this question, but his final word is that they seem to engage in conversation just as human beings do, although empirical verification is ultimately lacking. Now, this is just the kind of hesitation in the face of nature that Greek comedy leaps over when it puts animals on the stage. Right? Aristophanes' Birds goes to extraordinary lengths to dramatize the continuity between birdsong and human speech. When Tereus summons the various kinds of birds so that he can explain to them his plan for cosmic domination, he weaves the sounds of birdsong together with the sounds of human words that resemble them. What comes out of his mouth starts off sounding like a greeting in human language. Right? Epopopoi, he says, which could mean o hupu in Greek, but also resembles the weird exclamations of pain that tragic heroes like Tereus utter in the plays of Sophocles. It then turns back into pure sound. Right? Pop, 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 poi, pop, poi, eo, eo. Then it turns, right? Then finally it turns into a form of the verb to come. Ito, 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 which means come here. This general summons is followed by a division of the birds into their various kinds. First, an invocation of seed eaters that ends tio, 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 tio. Second, a call to berry feeders that ends trioto, trioto, toto brix. Then, a call to insectivores and seabirds that once again starts out as human language and ends as pure sound. Dero, 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 toro, 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 ticks, kickabao, toro, 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 lily licks. Dero means over here, but the rest is just sound. Now, given that the sound strings in this summoning song are prefaced by indications of lifestyle, it seems that Aristophanes is not imitating the calls of individual species or trying to portray birdsong in general, but instead representing kinds of birds. Okay. The audience hears a relationship between a particular set of sounds and a particular lifestyle, and this opens their ears to the possibility that what they do not understand when Tereus' song veers off into pure sound may still be informational for the birds to whom it is addressed. And dramatically, at least, that seems to be the case, right? Since the various kinds of birds do in fact understand what is being asked of them and make their appearance shortly thereafter. A chorus of 28 birds appears on the stage. The standard identifications are flamingo, cockerel, another hoopoe, partridge, francolin, widgeon, kingfisher, owl, jay, turtle dove, lark, reed warbler, time finch, rock dove, vulture, hawk, ringdove, cuckoo, redshank, shrike, gallinule, kestrel, grebe, bunting, lammergeier, woodpecker. Now, there's only one other play in all of Greek comedy that we know in which the chorus members were individually identified and costumed. And this is a play called Cities by a playwright called Eupolis, in which the chorus members represented individual cities in a play that seems to have been concerned with the diverse forms that human life took in them. So what is the right relationship between natural diversity and way of life, right? I mean, that seems to be the fundamental question that Birds is asking of its audience. So the plan for world domination concocted by Tereus and the Athenians requires the birds to abandon the diversity of their lifestyles and live together in a city that looks just like Athens. Their first job is to build a city wall. And in doing so, their organismic differences are instrumentalized as tools, right? So it's all sort of reported by a messenger. It would be very hard to stage. 30,000 cranes swallow stones for the foundations. Corncrakes shape the stones with their beaks. 10,000 storks make bricks. Curlews and other river birds serve as water carriers. Geese shovel clay with their feet. Herons carry hods. Ducks lay the finished bricks. Swallows apply plaster with their tails. And woodpeckers finish off the carpentry. It's funny, right? But the work of city building it's a parody of the division of labor that Aristotle and other ancient political theorists think is characteristic of political animals, human beings included, and which differentiates them from animals whose sociality takes the form of herding, right? Where all the members of the group get to do everything that any one of them is capable of, right? Whether they are any good at it or not. Right? So from this perspective, Birds is really, it's a tragedy in comic costume, right? The Athenians and their bird allies triumph at the end, but only at the cost of what made the play interesting in the first place. In the fantasy world of the ending, the various kinds of birds have abandoned their distinctive lifestyles for the monoculture of the human city, right? So this fantasy world, no human being will ever again get to ponder whether these animals, birds, are happier in their way of life than human beings are in theirs. So once again, I mean, Moby Dick is an instructive comparison, right? So what Ishmael learns about whale society is an alternative to the automation of human life on the Pequod, which is, I mean, the Pequod, an antecedent of the modern factory ship. But Melville is also conscious of the fact that the fate of whales, like the fate of wolves and bison, is now in human hands, and that their days may be numbered. It's one of the book's ironies, in fact, that Melville imagines whales seeking shelter from human predation underneath the polar ice caps. So there's a sense, I think, in which this kind of animal society story has to end in failure, right, from a literary perspective. Most fictions, you think about it, are tales of individuation, right, in which the lead character turns into him or herself as a result of what he or she experiences in the story. Animal society stories, by contrast, speak to a desire to shed our individuality, right, to lose ourselves, right, in the herd or the pack. A character whose desire to join an animal society was successful would have lost the plot, right, since he or she would now be doing what everyone else in the group was doing. Now, in this respect, the antitype of the animal society story are metamorphosis stories, since in these, right, the lead character experiences the most extreme individuation imaginable, acquiring the body of another animal while on the inside remaining the same animal that it was before. And I put it this way because it's important to remember that metamorphosis can go both ways, right? Animals can become human beings just as human beings can become animals. In fact, I mean, one of the things I try to show in my chapter on metamorphosis is that the famous highlights of the metamorphosis tradition, such as Ovid's great poem, are the flip side of the so-called animal bride or animal groom story, right, in which an animal falls in love with a human being and acquires a human body, but is subsequently exposed as an animal in human form, right? For example, the cat bride who sees a mouse at the wedding dinner and starts chasing it all around the room. Now, in fable literature, these stories often come with a moralizing tagline, right? Like, a leopard can't change its spots, right? The cat can't help being a cat. But these taglines are typically later additions, and early versions of these stories are much more concerned with understanding how the animal parts of ourselves are a source of social cohesion. A key text in my discussion of these types of stories is a poem from Antiquity that has been a persistent embarrassment to classical scholars because it compares the kinds of wives that husbands can have to kinds of animal. The longest piece of lyric poetry that we have. It's great, yeah. We didn't get more Sappho. We got this. God damn it. Anyhow, I mean, the poem, right, was by a poet named Simonides, has usually been viewed as little more than a misogynistic diatribe. But what's interesting about it is that, unlike the story of the cat bride, where the marriage is off as soon as the bride's animality is revealed, in Simonides' poem, husbands go on living with their pig wife, horse wife, dog wife, etc. Right? So not only is animality not grounds for divorce, but the piggishness of the pig wife, the horsiness of the horse wife, and the doggishness of the dog wife are apparently sources of marital stability. I mean, it's not exactly conjugal bliss, I won't say that, but everyone has some kind of animal for a wife. And unacknowledged interspecies cohabitation is not just the glue of married life, but of social life more generally, right? Since commenting on the animal wives of other people gives everyone in the poem something to talk about. The presence of animals in the most intimate recesses of human life turns out to be what holds human society together. Now, the poem's about the experience of being a husband, but towards the end, it sort of hints at the kinds of stories that wives tell when they are on their own, right? So it's sort of acknowledging that there's a sort of distaff side to these interspecies fantasies, right, which is unknown to the husbands. And it's also crucial, I think, that the husbands don't know exactly what it is that they are living with their animal wives. They're locked into their marriages by their wives' animality, but only the poet can say why, right? And so this is an interesting area of common ground with Ovid's Metamorphoses, right? The idea that we have a kind of subconscious yearning for intimacy with other forms of life, but that this yearning has to be satisfied unconsciously, right? So, I mean, some part of you may want to be a bear, but if you get turned into one, right, nothing good can come of that. And this idea returns in some very interesting ways in fiction written after Darwin. Now, Ovid, in the Metamorphoses, has a character named Glaucus, who becomes a sea creature after eating a magical herb by the seashore, but can remember nothing of his underwater adventures when he returns to the land. Now, Charles Kingsley, the author of The Water Babies, and the only recipient, it's interesting, the only recipient of a signed and inscribed pre-publication copy of The Origin of Species, called his own sort of protreptic to natural history, Glaucus, or The Wonders of the Shore. And in this book, Kingsley sort of veers wildly between the desire to join the organisms he studies, right, like Ovid's fishermen, and the sense that the renunciation of this desire to be with them is adequately compensated for by the scientific knowledge that such renunciation enables, right? So the naturalist of Glaucus longs for the transformation that Tom, the hero of The Water Babies, experiences unwilled, but he knows that only in art can a person become, quote, a companion of the fair semi-human forms with which the Hellenic poets peopled their sunny bays and firths. So among the ancients, art transformed the yearning for intimacy with non-human life into mythological belief. That's how Kingsley sees it. But for the moderns, this yearning has to be satisfied by science instead. So Kingsley represents what I call, the biophilic response to evolutionary knowledge, which you can see marvelously on display in the blurbs to Neil Shubin's You're in a Fish. Some of you may know that. But this book invites its readers on I'm going to quote, a journey into the 3.5 billion year history of the human body. And we'll teach them how our hands actually resemble fish fins, and major parts of our genome look and function like those of worms and bacteria. On the cover, Oliver Sacks explains that the book will change forever how you understand what it means to be human, and a big full-color flap called Your Body as You've Never Seen It Before proclaims the joys of evolutionary knowledge. Learn to love your body for what it really is, a jury-rigged fish, says Discover magazine. A delightful introduction to our skeletal structure, viscera, and other vital parts. The Los Angeles Times agrees. Love and delightful are both in capital letters. I don't really know, like, this is how you do scare quotes. I don't know how you do capitals. Anyhow, what these readers experience, when these readers experience their body in a way that's cognizant of what it shares with the physiology of fish, their knowledge takes the form of love. The biophobic alternative is imagined with equal delight in H.P. Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth. The cult of the Phoenician fish god Dagon lives on in an obscure corner of New England, and after barely escaping from Innsmouth with his life, Lovecraft's narrator discovers that his ancestors are from this town, and that this knowledge has been concealed from him. He now experiences the onset of fish metamorphosis in dreams. At first, he resists the understanding of his own being that these dreams offer him. But in time, the balance between conscious horror and unconscious pleasure begins to shift. He feels himself queerly drawn towards the unknown sea depths instead of fearing them, and awakens with a kind of exaltation instead of terror. In Lovecraft's fantasy of evolutionary regression, the human being is an animal that resists knowing what it is. Its narrator refuses to accept the true history of his body until this knowledge is forced upon him by a metamorphosis at the hands of superior beings. Now, Richard Dawkins has puzzled over why the human brain appears, quote, specifically designed to misunderstand Darwinism and find it hard to believe. But the answer, I think, may not be so far to seek. When an opportunity to acknowledge our continuity with other animals is at hand, human beings seem not so much to vacillate, but to opt immediately for one alternative or another. Either biophilic exaltation in the unity of life, or biophobic retrenchment in fantasies of our separateness. Thanks.
We have time for some questions. We'd like to use the microphone so we can capture your questions on our video recording. Please put your hands up and we'll come around and do our best to get around the room.
Thank you. I wonder how much of this view of people dealing with animals is really a way of dealing with human characteristics in disguise, and that in a sort of a safe way, so that I think about how we view some animals. For example, if you look at a rabbit, you look at a rat. A rabbit is cute and a rat is ugly, yet they're both rodents about the same size.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing there is certain human characteristics that we sort of extrapolate.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's certainly true. I think the hardest thing for us, I think, is to kind of, think ourselves back into a world in which there isn't any separate creation story for human beings, right? Which is where the Greeks were at, right? So I think for the Greeks, right? The cuteness of the rabbit or the ugliness of the rat. It's not just it's a response to what they are, kind of deep down, right? It's not just a kind of surface response, and it's. The cuteness of the bunny is also the cuteness that I have, right? And the ugliness of the rat, the ugliness that I have, right? It's not, they don't have the same distance that we still do, I think, living in a kind of, even if we don't accept a kind of separate creation story for human beings anymore, right? We're still living in the aftermath of that story, and it's hard to kind of get that close again, right? So is that? Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I am dredging up from the back of my mind a poem by Galway Kinnell. Can't think of the title, but as I recall, the subject was a hunter, and he killed maybe a bear or something like that.
Right.
And then he crawled in, I guess he skinned it or something, and he crawled in it. It was something to that effect.
Yeah, I think I've
anyway,
read that poem.
it was
yeah.
pretty powerful. I remember
Yeah.
when I read it
Yeah.
25 years ago, whenever it was.
Yeah.
So that's by way of that, I want, and you may not want to answer this question. It's because it's about hunting. I have a cousin who hunts, and I've talked to him about it and the feeling that he has when he hunts, and he also, loves nature and animals and stuff. And I can't imagine myself, having the gun and pointing it, and staring at the animal's eyes and actually shooting it.
Yeah.
So my question is, a long way around, do you still hunt? And if so, why? And or don't you? And if so, why not?
Well, no, I don't. The reason that I don't is just has to do with my, personal history. The person that I hunted with was my grandfather, who died, when I was 15. So at that point, the opportunity went away. Now, if he hadn't died then, who knows, right? Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. But I think, even in the way you kind of asked the question, I think you put your finger on what was absolutely the key element for me, maybe both in my own experience of hunting and in like this kind of amazing archive of hunting stories that I came up with, which is eye contact, right? I mean, that's the thing that seems to be sort of decisive for so many people who have, even if not sort of renounced hunting, but had some kind of transformative experience around it, right? So some of you may know the story that Aldo Leopold tells, right, in the Sand County Almanac about hunting a wolf, right, out in Arizona and kind of making eye contact with the wolf. There's an amazing story by Ernest Hemingway that it's his very last novel, the one that was published, I think, only posthumously, called The Garden of Eden. The sort of main male character in that is a kind of would-be novelist who's trying to write up this story of hunting an elephant with his father, right, when he's a young man. And I mean, sometimes that story has been excerpted and published as a separate story. Much more interesting and complicated to read it in the setting of the novel. But there again, I mean, it's like this moment of sort of eye contact with the other animal that seems to be decisive one way or another. I mean, you either kind of get beyond that and carry on, or you don't, right? That was the reason I ceased. So, yeah. But I'm very interested. I mean, I think hunters, as I said, have a particular kind of intimacy, right, with animals that most of us no longer have, right? I mean, the days in which the streets were full of animals, farms were in our backyards. I mean, those days are gone, right? So I think, that's one of the few, at least sort of leisure activities, if you want to call it that, that involve a kind of intimacy that is lost for most of us.
Hi, thank you. I had two questions. One, if you could repeat what was the title of the biophilic work that you were talking about?
Yeah, it's called, it's just called Biophilia. Biophilia by E.O. Wilson. It's an amazing book. I think sort of speaks in interesting ways to some of his other work. I mean, I think especially consilience. I mean, this idea of a sort of, kind of possible coming together of the sciences and humanities. I mean, it's been very influential for me. Yeah.
And then the other question was, I had understood that the iambic rhythm was natural to the English language, but I didn't know that it was natural to the Greek language.
Yeah,
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So Greek, ancient Greek, it's not stressed, right? It doesn't work through sort of stress accent. I mean, the ordinary language or the poetry, right? It works by pitch, right? And the way that the meter is made up in Greek poetry is through combinations of like long and short syllables, right? So it's purely quantitative, right? Not accentual. So the way in which sort of modern European poets attempt to replicate the kinds of things that ancient poetry does is by kind of imitating the pattern of long and short syllables with patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables. So yeah, I mean, the iambic pentameter is, the strange thing is, so that's how it works. I mean, when they want to do something that is kind of, pulling out something they like from sort of Antiquity's use of meter, that's the way they go about it. And I think Williams did an amazing thing, right? And kind of like finding this incredibly obscure meter, right? I mean, and this kind of buried discussion in this handbook of ancient Greek literature and kind of making it his own thing.
Well, thank you for a wonderful lecture. And I guess then my question is a bit of a concern about these kinds of trends that it seems both science and literature has been going into.
What kind of trends?
Just as the kind of trends of either biophilia or biophobia that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I do find it pretty fascinating to see this kind of, as you described it, a visceral delight in thinking that we're more like a fish than we might think, or this kind of repulsion to that very same factor.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's something that's repeated time and time again throughout the history of both science or scientific works and historical works. And yet, in an age where science and literature seem to be very heavily characterized by similarities to animals, and yet where in our lives we don't really interact with animals, I'm wondering if a lot of this is based more off of a kind of fictional creature rather than any living beast, and what might that actually mean for the way, or for what animal representations might be in relation to living creatures.
Well, that's interesting. So, I mean, what you're saying is that like, I mean, what I was describing as this sort of almost sort of instantaneous sort of gut reaction, sort of one way or the other, is more of a literary phenomenon than a real life phenomenon. Is that?
I mean, yeah, I guess that's just like one of the concerns that might be raised now, since almost nobody really interacts with wild animals anymore.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'd have to sort of, I'd have to canvass people, I guess. I mean, I suppose the reason that it seemed that way, or the reason I chose to sort of think about it, or did think about it that way in the book, was like, that's like how it happened to me. I mean, this thing with the beaver that I talk about, I mean, in more length in the book. I mean, it really was sort of like, a kind of flash of understanding. I was sort of like this instant feeling of connection. And, so the way I sort of tend to think about it or in other places in the book is that, you can either kind of go with that feeling of kind of sort of connection, or you can in some way kind of block it out, right? It's like, it's there, but you kind of don't let it rise to the surface or something. But yeah, I didn't think so much about, I mean, I guess I looked for examples in literature that kind of fleshed out that experience, I guess, rather than thinking to kind of question it, in relation to the present. What do you think? I mean...
Oh, man, well... I mean, it's not something that I've really written or read about. It's just kind of a concern that I feel is coming more and more to the fore, since we are living during the sixth mass extinction, and it seems that the disappearance of animals from throughout life might be a real concern, even in an age that's also characterized by the vast representation of animal life, even if it is just through videos, photographs, literature, scientific works.
Yeah. I mean, and there's, as you know, there's also been sort of anthropology of the laboratory, right? Which I must say I haven't really delved into that. It wasn't something that was kind of on my mind when I was writing the book. So, I suppose that would be a place to, or zoos, to think about the way in which kind of connection is kind of mediated by a particular setting. I'm a literary scholar.
Just to follow up on the question that was just asked.
Yes.
Your talk made me think about, our estrangement from our fellow animals, and also how in a lot of indigenous cultures, how people thank the animals for giving up, their lives to feed people, like the salmon ritual of the Pacific Northwest. And it's almost sort of like projecting that sort of that human maybe self-sacrifice onto the animal. And I think that's very interesting.
So tell me more about the last part. Yeah, I've been, one of the things that I did actually after writing the book, I did get very interested in like sort of native accounts of the killing of the bison, right? And what was that about? And I actually went. I learned Lakota. I studied Crow. I spent some time out west with people. I guess I have a sense of what it's like to live differently. But could you just sort of rephrase, like the thing you said about the end about sacrifice was very interesting to me. So.
Well, it's sort of more like a symbiotic relationship. It's a mutual dependence. The native peoples depend on the animals to survive, and they thank them for their sacrifice. It's almost sort of like, I know with the salmon ritual, it's almost like I don't want to say Christ figure or whatever, but giving up your life so
Right.
that others may live.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, my sense is, it varies tremendously from tribe to tribe. I mean, the kind of affect that's involved in it. I mean, among certain people, right, it seems to be almost have more the form of kind of contractual agreement, right? Where particular kinds of animals, have the status of sort of nations, right? And, a kind of contract exists between, the human nation and the, buffalo nation, right? Yeah, I mean, we certainly don't have that. That's for sure. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think, what we do have is literature, right? I mean, and, in the end, that's the claim that I make in the book is, the less we see the animals that our lives that still depend upon, really. I mean, the more literature, I think, can kind of be a way of putting us back into contact with them.
Thank you very much. A very provocative way of talking about literature and animals.
Thank you.
Is there a particular section of your book that deals with Renaissance imagery?
No, there isn't. I mean, that's funny that you asked me that. I mean, it was something that I kind of worried about. I guess everyone has worries about the questions that are going to come up in reviews, when they write a book. And, the question I was worried about was like, well, what about this jump from antiquity to the 20th century that, you don't...
Well, you think about the nymph complaining upon the death of her fawn and the absolute domination of Shakespeare with animal imagery.
Yeah.
And you wonder how that sensibility might have been a bridge between these things.
Yeah. I'm not a Renaissance scholar, so I don't want to say anything that, sounds kind of shallow or stupid with respect to the Renaissance. But, as I think about it now, so what interests me at the Greek end, right, was that in a way, animals start to kind of come into their own for the Greeks as a consequence of a sort of withdrawal of divinity from the world, right? Sort of older sort of Greek myths, speak about, kind of animal protector figure, right? A kind of, mistress who sort of, is responsible for the, wild animals who get hunted in ways that are kind of, familiar from other cultures. Whereas, with, the so-called sort of Greek miracle, that kind of theology starts to kind of withdraw, right? And animals no longer stand under the protection of kind of tutelary deities, right? And so you inevitably, right, see them as things in them, sort of, or differently, as things in themselves, right? Not under anyone's protection. So, that for me is what sort of Greek antiquity has in common with, sort of 20th century modernity, right? This kind of withdrawal of the sense that animals are under anyone's protection, right? Which has, obviously both positive and negative consequences. They're no longer the subject of mythology, right? They're now just are what they are. So, I don't know. I don't know if that would work for the Renaissance. I didn't explore the Renaissance. Do you have any thoughts about where the Renaissance would stand on that, or even Shakespeare?
Yeah, well, one just wonders about if there's a historical continuity that you would be curious to know what it is. After all, the Renaissance was a resurgence of views of the ancients, and you'd wonder to what degree are those views reverberating in Renaissance literature. And then you have Descartes, is an animal a soul or not?
Right. Yeah, Descartes kind of like the bad guy in many versions of animal studies, right? Animals are just kind of, like robots basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it would definitely be, especially the popularity of Ovid's Metamorphoses, right? It's so hugely popular in the Renaissance. It would be interesting to know, sort of you know, how much sort of commonality the Renaissance animal has with, you know, the sort of ancient animal, or whether the stories are just, you know, being appropriated for new ends. Yeah.
Your next book.
Thank you.
Thank you.